Hey guys, so the topic of this recording is following professors' written instructions for writing assignments. I've noticed that oftentimes when students have trouble with assignments, it's not necessarily because they don't have the skills or because they're not trying, but because they may have misunderstood the professor's instructions and they don't really understand what it is the professor is asking for. So what I want to do right now is I want to pretend that the instructions for our next short writing assignment were written by another professor, and I'm going to pretend to be a student. And I'm going to read these instructions, and I'm going to speak out loud to you how it is that I'm understanding these instructions, and specifically, what are the things that I'm inferring about what the professor wants, that the professor has not said explicitly, right? What is it that the professor probably assumes I'm going to do that they haven't felt the need to write in black and white? Okay, so let's take a look. Okay, so here are the instructions. In Chapter 3 of Rivertown, Peter Hessler recounts his struggle learning Chinese when serving as a Peace Corps volunteer in Sichuan in the 1990s. In a couple paragraphs, about 400 words, please address the following questions. What seem to be Hessler's main sources of motivation? What demotivates him? And what seems to be the key factor in his success? Please double space your assignment and use 12-point Times New Roman font. Okay, so this is a pretty typical prompt that you might see for a short response essay, you know, a reading response or something like that, that your teachers might ask you to write. First off, so what do I notice about this, right? What do I infer as a student reading this? One thing I can tell is that it seems to me that the professor is interested primarily in my understanding of the text, right? The professor is interested in, first off, did I read it, right? How do I understand the text, right? So on one level, right, they want to kind of check and make sure that you have read it carefully, right? But they also kind of want to like open a window into your brain, right, and look in and see what thoughts are going on in this student's brain as they're reading the essay, right? So anyway, that's the first thing I'm inferring, is that this professor is interested in my understanding of the text, right? And the key thing here is the text, right? They're interested in Rivertown, right? They're interested in Chapter 3, right? They're not expecting me to go online and Google Peter Hessler, right? And they're also not interested in my opinion, right? This is key, right? They're interested in my understanding, right? They're interested in how I interpret what I've read, but they're not interested in my opinion. I think those are two different things. It's a subtle difference, right? But I'm not really saying I believe. What I'm going to say is, here is how I understand it, right? And in fact, actually, I should say, I'm not going to use the word I at all, right? I'm guessing that this professor is interested in me describing what it is I'm seeing in Rivertown, but without using the word I. Right, that will be pretty common. Okay, so now let's look specifically at these three questions and try and understand what is it that the professor is looking for. First off, so the professor says, address these three questions, right? So does the professor want me to try to answer all of the questions? Well, because there are only three of them, right, I'm guessing probably yes, right? I'm guessing that the professor would not consider this a complete assignment if I didn't answer all those three questions, right? Now you might see a prompt where the professor writes 10 questions, right? And if they're saying write 400 words and answer these 10 questions, they're probably giving you those questions just as a way to get you thinking, right? And maybe you just choose to answer a few, right? But if it's this few questions, I think it's safe to assume that the professor wants me to answer all of them, right? To address all of them, right? So that's the first thing, right? And what's this going to look like? Well, I mean, I guess one natural way to do it, maybe you could have one short paragraph about that question, one short paragraph about that question, and one short paragraph about that question. That would be a way to do it, right? These first two questions seem related to each other, so another way to do it might be to write one paragraph addressing those two questions, and then one paragraph addressing that. I'm not sure, right? But those would be some of the options that I'd probably lean towards if I were a student answering this question. And then finally, one other thing I noticed, right? Okay, what does seem to be his main sources of motivation, right? So one or more sources of motivation, what demotivates him, and what seems to be the key factor in his success. Notice that factor is in the singular, right? The 单数, right? So I interpret from here that the professor wants me to take a position, right? The professor doesn't want me to say, oh, there were 5 different things that were responsible for his success. I think the professor is kind of wanting me to point at something that is most important, right? So this is one situation where paying attention to singular and plural can matter, right? This is not the key factors. This is, the factor, right? So notice that also these are things where these things are not written down in black and white in the story, right? You're going to have to infer. You're going to have to guess. You're going to have to read between the lines of what Hessler says, right? So you're not just recounting what went on in the story, right? You're interpreting, right? You're explaining based on your own understanding of it, right? And this leads me to my next point, which is this professor expecting me to summarize Rivertown? Well, that's a very good question, right? And the answer to that question is yes and no, right? Remember what I said before, which is that a lot of assignments that professors will give you, they won't explicitly use the word summarize, right? However, they're going to be expecting you to write about the text using all of these summarizing tools that we've been talking about, right? So in a way, this professor is kind of asking me to summarize Rivertown, right? In the sense that the professor is asking me to explain, right, my understanding of the text in my own words, right? The professor's not asking for my opinion, right? The professor is probably to do this well, I'm going to have to explain it in such a way that it would be understandable for someone who hasn't read the text, right? I'm going to have to use those voice markers, right? Hessler describes, Hessler recounts how, Hessler writes, et cetera, right? To remind the reader that I am describing what Hessler wrote in his story, right? And then finally, right, it's going to have to be organized logically according to my own understanding of the logic, rather than just going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These things happened, right? So is the professor asking me to summarize sort of as a whole the entire thing? No, right? However, they are asking me to use all of those summarizing skills in order to address these specific questions that they've laid out here, right? So in that sense, it's sort of like a targeted summary, right? It's summarizing the text with regard to some specific aspects of it. Okay, moving on to this, double space your assignment, use 12-point Times New Roman font, right? That's pretty clear, right? But there are other things that a professor will just expect you to do as far as formatting your assignment that might irritate them if you don't, right? One thing is they want you to put your name on the assignment, right? Consider your professor might print all of these out, right, and look at them. And if your name is not on the assignment, they'll have no idea who wrote it, right? It would be good to put your name in the file name, right? .docx, right? Whose assignment, right? Right now I have like 12 short writing assignments by different, in my folder, and I don't know who they're by. I have to click on them and open them to tell, right? So putting your name in the name of the folder would be good, right? They're also expecting you to indent your paragraphs, right? 手行缩进, right? Remember that. And this is something that we just expect about written text, right? The professor shouldn't have to tell you to indent your paragraphs, right? That's basic stuff, right? So those are some of the things that I know that I'm going to have to do about the formatting that the professor's not going to ask me to, right? If there are a lot of pages, put numbers on my pages, that's going to help. Okay, the professor's not always going to put this, right? They're not going to say how they grade your write your assignment necessarily, right? They might. If they do, read it carefully, right? Because they are definitely going to follow those rules. If they're taking the time to explain to you in advance how they're going to grade it, expect them to follow those rules, right? So I'm saying I'm going to do these things. I'd expect you should read those carefully. And if you're not sure about what that means, ask me, right? Okay. And then we have the timeline, the due dates, right? Okay, I think that's everything that I need to say about this. But I'm hoping that through listening to me, you can understand more what it is that a professor giving an assignment like this would expect that they might not necessarily state explicitly in black and white. Oh, one last thing. In a couple paragraphs, about 400 words, a couple, that means more than one, right? So we know the professor is probably not expecting just one paragraph, right? What does this mean exactly about 400 words? Could it be 300? Yeah, maybe. Although if it's a short assignment, you know, it can't be that much shorter than it and say anything, right? Could it be 500 words? And in general, plus or minus 100 words is probably okay. So anything more than that, check with the professor. I don't know. But anyway, so that's the bottom line. Hope that this makes things make a little more sense to you. All right, looking forward to reading your assignment.